free from the marriage, the final goodbye. Leaving Austen Manor and stepping onto the bustling street, I hesitated for a moment. For the past 5 years, since marrying into the Austen family, I had been like a caged canary, trapped in a prison of luxury and isolation. That secluded life had severed almost all my ties to this vibrant city. Fortunately, the nightmare lasted only 5 years, not a day longer. I checked into a hotel and handed my credit card to the receptionist. "Please book me a flight back to my hometown. I'll stay here for a few days." The hotel staff promptly took care of the arrangements. Though my flight was scheduled for the next morning, by that afternoon, the city had already been thrown into chaos. Peering through the curtains, I spotted police cars and officers swarming the streets. Ever since Albert had taken charge 3 years ago, the city had enjoyed a rare period of peace, earning praise from municipal leaders. That evening, when room service delivered my dinner, the attendant offered a cautious reminder. "There's a major case underway. The police are conducting a citywide search. Please remain in your room. A special car will take you to the airport tomorrow morning." Even with my windows and doors shut, the flashing police lights pierced through the curtains, casting restless shadows across the room. I figured Albert must have encountered a particularly challenging case. But with his sharp mind and relentless dedication, he would surely resolve it soon. He was always shrewd, efficient, and unwavering in his duty. That was the Albert the first knew. At dawn, I stepped into the hotel-arranged car. The city exit was clear. After a brief exchange between the driver and the traffic officer on duty, we passed through without trouble. Sitting in the back seat, I faintly heard sirens wailing in the distance. "Madam, there's no need to worry," the driver reassured me, glancing at me through the rearview mirror. "The city is under strict checkpoints, but we've passed them safely. We'll be at the airport soon." As I stepped out of the car, a light drizzle began to fall. Holding my boarding pass, I smoothly passed through security and boarded my flight home. 5 years of marriage had left my heart desolate, stripping away all expectations. As the cabin door shut, I caught sight of a black car speeding toward the airport through the rain, its window partially rolled down. Whoever was inside must have been drenched. I had no idea who they had come for, but it didn't matter. Whoever they were looking for was already gone. Back in my hometown, I used my savings to buy a small house by the lake. I resumed my previous job as a doctor, working at the clinic during the day and continuing my medical studies at night. One evening, as I was returning home from work, I discovered a boy lying in the grass by the roadside, covered in blood. His arms, thighs, and half of his abdomen had been ravaged by wild dogs, his internal organs faintly visible. Yet, miraculously, he was still alive. Fortunately, I had a first aid kit with me. I quickly bandaged his wounds to stop the bleeding and rushed him to the hospital. Given the severity of his injuries, I doubted he would survive. But against all odds, he endured a 7-day fever and finally opened his eyes on the 8th day. His gaze was clear, deep, and strangely pure. "Who are you?" he asked weakly, then murmured to himself, "Are you my mother?" "Then who am I?" From that day forward, a boy named Leonardo Bright became part of my small home. Leonardo, who had survived a brutal attack, had the tenacity of a little wolf cub. He was an orphan of unknown origin, and I was a single woman new to the village, making us the subject of constant gossip. Having endured the contempt of the Austen family, I was indifferent to rumors. But Leonardo couldn't tolerate them. He always defended me. One night, while I was taking a bath, I heard a commotion outside, followed by a sharp scream. Throwing on my bathrobe, I rushed out to find Leo fiercely beating a drunkard with a broom. From that night on, whenever I took a bath, he would sit on a small stool outside the bathroom. "Mom, you're not alone. I can protect you." Leo woke before dawn every day, carrying bucket after bucket of water to fill the tank, brewing coffee, making breakfast, tidying the house, and only waking me once the sun had risen. He fed the chickens and ducks with leftover vegetables, reinforced the yard's fence with thin rope, and even climbed onto the roof to repair leaks. "You don't have to do this." I'm the mother, I told him. Because you're the mother, Leo said, placing a peeled egg on my plate. It's only natural for a son to take care of his mother. His words stirred memories of my own children, far away in Santarissum. After they were born, my son and daughter had been handed over to Vera Bright, Albert's mother, to raise. They only visited me once a year on my birthday, greeting me with perfect politeness, yet remaining painfully distant. I cut the egg in half and gave Leo a piece. And it's only natural for a mother to take care of her son. Seeing my smile, Leo lowered his head and quickly finished his portion. Not long after, I sent him to school. The village school was filled with rowdy children, but Leo always sat upright, listening attentively. Recognizing his diligence, the teacher often kept him after class for extra tutoring. One winter day, heavy snowfall made me worry he'd struggle to get home. Taking an umbrella, I went to pick him up. As I reached the classroom door, I overheard the teacher asking, "Why are you so hardworking?" Leo's voice was young but steady. "I know I'm not related to my mother by blood," he replied. "But she raised me alone with great care, treating me as her own child. If I don't study hard and succeed in giving her a good life, how could I ever repay her kindness?" Standing outside in the falling snow, I felt the chill against my skin, yet warmth filled my heart. Day by day, year by year, Leo graduated from the village primary school and was accepted into a prestigious middle school in the county. His academic excellence and reputation earned him a full tuition waiver. He came home every weekend, always bringing good news. "Mom, I was the top student in last month's exam again, 7 months in a row now. The principal said university admission officers will be visiting soon to select students for early admission to top universities. I made the shortlist. He hopes you can come to the school for a meeting." Overjoyed, I agreed. That weekend, Leo and I traveled to the county. The school principal greeted us warmly, showering Leo with praise. "He's an exceptional student, intelligent, hardworking, with a bright future ahead." Then he lowered his voice. "The admissions officer visiting this time has been evaluating students in our county for 3 years, but hasn't selected anyone yet. They value not only academic performance, but also family background. For Leo's future, Ms. Bright, please be well prepared." I nodded as we reached the meeting room. At the door, the principal whispered, "Sir, Leonardo's mother has arrived." The doors opened. I straightened my clothes and stepped inside. "Hello, I'm Irene Bright, Leo's mother." I was just about to extend my hand when I heard a sharp intake of breath, followed by the distinct crash of a cup shattering on the floor. Startled, I instinctively looked up. My gaze met a pair of familiar eyes, stunned, dazed, filled with a silence that spoke volumes. I never expected to see him again. Albert. He looked thinner than before, his face gaunt, lined with exhaustion and sorrow. His jaw clenched as he stepped forward, his bloodshot eyes burning into mine. I lowered my head, standing respectfully, as one should in the presence of someone like him. This was how it should be. The way a nobody and a powerful man interacted. But Albert's voice, low and strained, cracked the air. "Irene." His tone carried a storm of suppressed anger and something deeper, something raw. For the first time, Albert Austin had lost control. The past that brought us here. The Austin Group had once teetered on the brink of collapse. My father had saved it, earning the deep gratitude of Paul Austin, Albert's father. In return, Paul vowed to repay him, leaving behind an equity certificate as proof of his promise. But my father's intervention came at a cost. Business rivals retaliated. On his deathbed, he urged me to seek the Austins' protection. After enduring countless hardships and near-death encounters, I finally reached the Austin Group's headquarters. Paul, racked with guilt over my father's fate, believed marrying me into the Austin family would secure my future and compensate for my loss. That was how I met Albert. It was winter. I stood in the company's grand lobby, watching as a tall figure approached through the falling snow. Dressed in a black windbreaker, he exuded an air of quiet dominance. At the time, Albert was already a business tycoon, extraordinary, untouchable. It was only natural to admire him. But I knew I wasn't a match for him. I politely declined Paul's offer, suggesting that a generous settlement and a city center apartment would be enough. I had studied medicine under my father's guidance since childhood. A peaceful life was all I had ever wanted. Irene Bright, Albert's mother, sneered at my refusal. "She has some self-awareness, at least," she mocked. "How could an elite like Albert marry a country girl like her? Everyone knows Albert and Lindsay Paisley have been inseparable since childhood. They'll be engaged the moment Lindsay graduates. A perfect match, unlike some nobody who doesn't even know high-end brands." I never intended to interfere. Paul, realizing my stance, agreed to finalize the compensation after Christmas. That Christmas Eve, the Austin Group's skyscraper glowed with festive lights. Dara hosted an extravagant gathering on the rooftop, inviting the city's elite. Lindsay Paisley stood front and center, the perfect future bride. Avoiding the crowd, I retreated to a quiet corner, sipping champagne beneath the moonlight. Then, suddenly, a force shoved me toward the pool's edge. I had known how to swim since childhood, but at that moment, a sudden cramp in my leg paralyzed me. As I struggled, sinking into the water, a figure leaped into the pool. I gasped, inhaling water, my senses blurring. Instinctively, I clung to him. When I regained consciousness, I saw a drenched shirt clinging to a solid chest. The spotlight illuminated the platform, and guests stood around us, whispering. They accused me of deliberately seducing Albert. But in my hometown, boys and girls often played in the water together, their clothes getting wet. It was nothing scandalous. The more I tried to explain, the more they doubted me. Then, Paul Austin made a shocking announcement. In 3 days, Irene will marry Albert. I wasn't the only one caught off guard. Even now, I could vividly recall the expressions of those present, Vera's shock and fury, the disdain on the faces of the wealthy socialites, the contempt of the powerful men in the room. Lindsay's expression was the most complex of all, anger, regret, sadness, despair, jealousy, and hatred twisted together. Only Albert's face remained unreadable, ice-cold. I couldn't tell what he was thinking. That night, the proud business tycoon had been unwillingly tied to me. And I, young and naive, believed I had secured an exceptional man, never realizing that my dignity would be trampled beneath his feet. 3 years later. The meeting room was silent. I stood respectfully, unmoving, not daring to speak. Albert seemed to struggle to suppress his emotions, barely managing to say a single word before stopping himself. After a moment, his deep voice broke the silence. "Do you have anything to tell me?" I kept my head lowered. "We've been divorced for 3 years, he continued, his voice eerily calm, "but Leonardo is 9. He hesitated for a beat before asking, "Is he, your adopted child?" Albert was always composed. Even in anger, he rarely showed emotion. But beneath the surface of his even tone, I could sense the restrained tension, the underlying danger. I thought for a moment, then answered truthfully. "Yes. Leo is my adopted son." There was a long pause. Then, Albert gave a slow nod, his voice softening slightly. "If he's your adopted son, then in some way, he's connected to me as well." "Of course, I will. Mr. Austin." I cut him off, slowly raising my head to meet his gaze. "Leo has nothing to do with you." "Neither do I." After leaving the past behind, I returned to my hometown and finally fulfilled my dream of becoming a gynecologist. I spent my days delivering babies and treating gynecological conditions, gradually building a strong reputation in the area. Life became peaceful. That weekend, Leo came home. For 2 consecutive nights, he stayed up preparing medicine, grinding herbs, compounding formulas, carefully packaging over a dozen bottles of potion. Sensing an opportunity, I gently asked, "Has Albert been giving you a hard time?" Leo shook his head. "No. He just keeps asking about you." He looked at me intently. Mom, did you know him before? Lowering my gaze, I nodded. Leo hesitated before asking again. Mom, do you not like him? I nodded once more. Leo studied me for a moment, then simply said, I see. After that, he never mentioned Albert again. A week passed in peace. Then, Albert arrived, shattering the town's tranquility. A fleet of luxury cars swept through the streets, drawing curious stares. Leo leaped out of the car first, his face stern. The bodyguards moved swiftly, opening the opposite car door. Albert stepped out, flanked by two children. They were twins, beautiful, their features unmistakably his. They bore no resemblance to me, inheriting only Albert's striking good looks. Mom. Leo ran toward me, planting himself protectively in front of me. I noticed the red marks on his wrist, as though he had been forcefully pulled. My heart clenched with distress. Albert looked at me, then bent down and whispered something to the two children. Go ahead. The twins hesitated for a moment before stepping forward, their movements graceful and composed. But as they approached, a cold shiver ran down my spine. My entire body trembled involuntarily. I had spent countless nights outside the ICU, haunted by the fear of watching the vital signs on the monitor drop during my hemorrhage after childbirth. I had once loved my children deeply, more than anything in the world. In the coldest months of winter, I had sneaked into their lavish garden to build 4 snowmen, hoping that when they woke up and stepped outside, they would know that their mother was always by their side. When my daughter suffered a relentless high fever that no medicine could cure, I had, without hesitation, drawn my own blood, desperately clinging to the absurd belief that a mother's love could heal all wounds. And when they were taken from me, I had clung to the nanny's sleeve, refusing to let go. You are of such a low status, how could you possibly raise them? Mrs. Vera Austin will raise them herself. You have no right to refuse. Besides, you are their mother. When they grow up, they will naturally be close to you. But time passed, and instead of closeness, all I received from them was coldness and indifference. I remembered that day in the mansion, the day I discovered a maid and the butler had been secretly involved. She had hidden her pregnancy, terrified of being fired. When I found her in her 7th month, she was already going into premature labor. I had no choice but to help her deliver the baby. Just as the newborn let out its first cry, the door to the servants' quarters burst open. Vera stormed in, her face twisted in fury. She demanded that I be punished, beaten in public as an example. I curled up on the cold floor, racked with pain, drenched in sweat, humiliated and defenseless. And yet, the deepest wound was not the punishment. It was my daughter, clinging to Vera, ignoring me entirely. It was my son, his face filled with resentment, pointing at me and shouting. Your actions have disgraced the Austin family. You don't deserve to be our mother. Now, the twins stood before me, lowering their heads. Mom, they called softly. I smiled faintly, lowering my head humbly. I'm sorry, you must have mistaken me for someone else, I said gently. I'm just an ordinary gynecologist. How could I be your mother? I had done nothing wrong. Even if that maid was a disgrace to their world. Even if that child was deemed illegitimate. Even if delivering babies was considered lowly work in their eyes. None of that changed the truth, I had done what was right. But Albert's visit had shattered the peaceful life Leo and I had built. After they left, the neighbors couldn't stop asking questions. Who was that distinguished-looking man? Who were those adorable twins? I thought carefully before answering. The mother of those twins suffered heavy bleeding during childbirth. She nearly died. Mr. Austin's mother asked me to save the children and ignore the mother's condition. But I saved all 3 of them. They're just a little grateful to me. That's all. I didn't know why Albert had brought the children to see me. Nor did I want to know. It didn't matter anymore. 2 pregnant women in the community were due to give birth soon and had contacted me in advance. I triple-checked my supplies, hemostatic agents, sedatives, blood-activating and stasis-resolving agents, sterile surgical scissors, syringes. Then, I carefully reviewed their medical records, running through every possible complication in my mind. These were the things that truly deserved my attention. Albert didn't stop at disrupting my life once. He transferred the twins to the county school, where they became classmates with Leo. Soon after, the school suddenly shut down under the pretense of renovations, sending all the students home. Albert personally escorted Leo back. This time, he didn't just sit in his luxury car and watch me from a distance. He got out and walked straight toward me. His voice was low, almost a whisper. "Rosalind isn't feeling well. She wants to see you." I looked at the girl in the pair of twins. Her face was pale, and despite the summer heat, she wore a delicate shawl draped over her thin shoulders. I remained indifferent. "If she's not feeling well, you should take her back to the city to see a doctor. Or return to the sanatorium and find a specialist for treatment. It's getting late, you should leave soon." I pulled Leo's hand and turned to go home, but before I could take a step, a strong grip seized my wrist. Albert's expression darkened, his jaw clenched in frustration. "Rosalind is also your child." His words felt like a signal. Rosalind took a graceful step forward, each movement exuding the refined elegance of a noble lady. Her skirt swayed gently as she walked, her delicate shoes barely visible beneath the fabric. She wrapped her arms around my waist, pressing her feverish face against my chest. Her voice was soft and trembling. "Mom, I feel awful. A doctor first." In the end, Rosalind and Victor stayed. As a doctor, I couldn't ignore a patient in need. Rosalind curled up on the small bed in the guest room, wrapped tightly in a custom-made silk quilt, deliberately ignoring the plain cotton one beside her. She was clearly uncomfortable in her chosen position, but she insisted on it. I said nothing. After examining her, I turned to Albert. "She's unwell. You should take her back to the sanatorium as soon as possible." Albert's voice was low. "The company is in the middle of an important merger. I don't have time to care for her." He hesitated, then added, "But the school entrance exams haven't ended yet." I sighed softly. "Then let them finish their exams quickly, so Rosalind can return sooner." Albert frowned, his sharp gaze locking onto me. "You just want the exams to end quickly for your adopted son's sake. And you want us to leave early, to get rid of us, don't you?" I met his gaze and nodded. "Yes." Albert's expression twisted with anger. "Don't you care at all? About me, about our children?" "Not our children," I replied evenly. "Yours." Rosalind and Victor Austin were Albert Austin's children. They were raised by Vera Austin. They had nothing to do with Irene Bright. I had long since let go. Albert's face turned pale. His lips quivered slightly, his usual composure cracking. "We're just separated, temporarily apart. You'll always be their mother. And they'll always be our children." Before I could respond, he turned abruptly and left the room. I watched his retreating figure, noticing something I had never seen before: disarray. Albert's disarray was evident in his unsteady steps. Mine had been complete destruction. The past. When had it begun? Perhaps the day I overheard him speaking to a friend. I married Irene by accident. I was interested in Lindsay Paisley, we would have been a power couple. But my father insisted. He said Irene's reputation would suffer, though, honestly, I didn't care. Still, if I didn't marry her, the company's stock price would have taken a hit. So, after weighing the pros and cons, I had no choice but to go through with it. Or perhaps the day I found out I was pregnant. The company is at a critical stage. Having a child now will affect my work. Get an abortion. Or maybe it was the winter night I built 4 snowmen in the garden, hoping our children would see them and know I was thinking of them. Albert had kicked them over without hesitation. "Don't play such tricks here. This is not something a lady of your status should do." Or the day Vera punished me in front of everyone, and Albert simply watched, cold and indifferent. How can you lower yourself like this? You're the mistress of the Austen family. Moment after moment, day after day, until I had nothing left to feel. Disarray? I had become numb to it. A different life. After Albert left, I asked Leo to look after the twins while I grabbed my medical kit and headed to the southern slums of town. A woman was in labor. The delivery went relatively smoothly, 2 hours in labor, 500 milliliters of blood loss, a second-degree perineal tear. But the baby was born safely. This was one of the easier cases I had handled. When I finally returned home, exhausted, I heard raised voices coming from inside. An argument. Again. Victor's voice was the first to break the silence, filled with rage. Who would want to come to this place? If Dad hadn't forced us, we'd still be at Sanatorium's best private school. Rosalind added angrily, "Why did you kick us out? You're just a country bumpkin, a filthy..." Victor cut in, his voice dripping with contempt. A filthy lowborn. A pariah. She seduced my father, and now we're stuck in this miserable place, forced to leave our noble school. It's all her fault. Rosalind's voice wavered as she began to sob. I miss Grandma. I want to go home. I instinctively touched my chest. Once, words like these would have shattered me. But now, I felt strangely calm. I deliberately made some noise, and the room fell silent. As I stepped inside, the 3 children sat around the table, each with a bowl of fish soup in front of them. The twins looked visibly unsettled, perhaps realizing I had overheard them. Mom. Leo stood up and took the heavy medical box from me. I washed my hands and returned to the table, where an extra bowl of fish soup had been placed. I smiled. Mrs. Porter gave birth to a daughter. Leo nodded. Last week, Mr. Porter and I took the bus into the county together. He had a feeling it would be a girl, so he bought some cute onesies in advance. Leo and I spoke casually about ordinary, trivial matters. But somehow, this seemed to make the twins uncomfortable. Bang! Victor slammed his hand against the table, his eyes burning with anger. You heard what I said, didn't you? Before I could respond, he continued darkly, did you think I was afraid of you hearing it? You don't deserve to be with Father at all. His voice grew sharper. You have no powerful connections, no wealth, nothing for us to rely on. When Rosalind gets married and I enter the business world, people will look down on us because of you. I placed a steady hand on Leo's arm, preventing him from reacting. Then, I turned to the twins and asked, softly, if I weren't here, how would you even exist? Victor and Rosalind froze, momentarily speechless. Shortly after, Albert arrived to pick them up. As we stood in awkward silence, a voice suddenly interrupted. Dr. Bright. Odelia just fell, she's bleeding and won't stop. Before I could even turn, Leo had already grabbed the medical kit and a flashlight. It's getting dark, Mom. I'll go with you. Albert stepped forward, blocking our path. He reached out to Leo. Give me the medical kit. Leo hesitated, eyeing him warily. Albert then turned to me, his gaze deep and unreadable. I'll drive you there. It'll be faster. I grabbed the first aid kit and walked briskly toward Albert's Land Rover. The drive. Inside the car, I immediately pulled up Odelia's electronic medical records and scanned them carefully. Albert turned on the interior lights, the soft glow illuminating the space. I ignored him, my full attention on the screen. Do you want some water? He suddenly asked. No. I didn't look up. A moment later, he asked again, do you want something to eat? I can have takeout sent here from your favorite restaurant. I'm not hungry. My focus remained on the medical records. After another pause, he spoke again. The temperature inside the car. Could you please be quiet? I frowned sharply and finally looked up at him. After a brief moment of silence, I said firmly, this is urgent. Please don't distract me. Odelia's plea. Odelia had endured a difficult pregnancy. Severe morning sickness. Swelling that made it painful to move. Trouble breathing. By the 7th month, her vision had begun to blur. She had struggled to carry the baby to term. No one expected an emergency to occur at the last moment. Odelia seemed to sense it coming. Her frail fingers grasped my wrist tightly, desperation filling her eyes. "Save the baby, please. I don't care what happens to me. Just save my child." I gently moved Odelia's hand away and spoke in a steady tone. "The child's survival depends on your will. If you fight, he will be born. But if you give up, he will die with you." Odelia gritted her teeth and pushed forward with all her strength. When I stepped out of her home, Albert was waiting by the car, my coat in his hands. The night air was misty, carrying the faint scent of jasmine. Once, I had stood just like this, coat in hand, waiting alone for him to come home from work. The Austin Group's headquarters was far from our villa. Every evening, after work, he would go straight to Paul to report, and I would worry about him being tired, about him catching a cold in the rain, about him forgetting to eat. So I brought a coat, an umbrella, and a thermos, waiting for him outside. At first, I could still wait in the Austin Manor's living room. Then, he stopped allowing me inside. So I waited in the car. And later, he forbade me from coming at all. "There are so many people in the company. Mother will handle those things. Even if you have nothing to do, don't come to headquarters so often." I had remembered those words well. So I kept my distance. And now, standing before him, I gave a slight nod. "Mr. Austin, thank you for bringing me here." Albert looked away. "We were a couple once." "Why so formal?" He stepped aside. "Get in the car." "No." I met his gaze and said softly, "I just finished a delivery. I'm covered in blood. I won't dirty your car." I borrowed an umbrella from Odelia's family and walked toward the road, stepping past the sleek, expensive Land Rover. By the artificial lake, the lotus flowers were withering, their leaves drooping, a quiet scene of decay. But though the flowers would fall this year, the lake would bloom again next spring. Unlike the ornamental pools at Austin Manor, where the scenery never changed, carefully maintained to always appear perfect. Footsteps sounded behind me. I stopped and turned. Albert stood there. He still looked refined in his tailored suit, but the rain had muddied his custom leather shoes. A strange sight. In the past or now, Albert and I had never truly belonged together. "Albert." I finally said his name. He stilled. A flicker of hope crossed his face, and when he spoke, there was a tremor of joy in his voice. "You." I interrupted, "Why did you bring the children to see me?" Albert hesitated before answering slowly. "There have been too many misunderstandings between us. I want you to come back to sanatorium with me. I want us to be a family again." I turned my head slightly, saying nothing. Albert, usually so reserved, was suddenly talkative. "I know I was cold, distant. But I never meant to ignore you. I was used to calculating gains and losses, to making logical decisions. But with you, I lost all sense of reason. I didn't know how to love you or what was right." His voice grew more urgent. "It won't happen again, Irene. I've realized my feelings. He exhaled shakily, then finally said it. "I love you." I looked at him, lost in thought. Once, just a glance from him would have set my heart racing. But now, I felt nothing. Only a strange, quiet calm. "Irene." Albert stepped closer and took my hand. "I've never remarried. You're the only one in my heart." "Irene," Albert stepped closer, holding my hand. "I've never remarried. You've always been in my heart." I looked down at our clasped hands and, after a moment, asked, "Would you be willing to stay in this small town for me? To give up your position as CEO?" Albert stiffened. For a brief second, hesitation flickered in his eyes. I remained calm, detached, even. You say there were misunderstandings between us, but I understood everything perfectly. My voice was quiet, steady. I've always known that the Austin Group and your position in the business world mean more to you than I ever did. Before our marriage, you wanted to marry a rich heiress for a business alliance. After our marriage, you kept your relationships with those women ambiguous. Do you know when I truly gave up on you? I let the silence stretch between us before answering my own question. It wasn't when Vera told me you planned to marry a more powerful woman and asked me to leave on my own. Nor was it when I unilaterally proposed divorce and you agreed without hesitation. It was when I discovered the blueprint of the mansion you designed in college, the one you planned to share with your future noble wife. After I filed for divorce, I had to wait 30 days to receive the final decree. Albert left for an overseas business trip almost immediately due to a company merger, while I remained in limbo, no longer his wife, yet unable to completely sever ties. I had planned to move out of the master bedroom, but before I could, a team of construction workers arrived. You don't need to move, Vera's assistant had told me with a polite yet insincere smile. How could a rich young lady live in a room you once occupied? Besides, Mr. Austin designed a mansion himself in college, specifically to marry a noble woman. From the architectural style to the interior design, everything was custom-made at the highest level, worthy of his status. The Austin Group had wealth to spare and had purchased an entire estate to construct that mansion. I stood on the balcony and watched as it took shape, rising from blueprint to reality, from foundation to roof, lavish and breathtaking. At that moment, I finally understood. No matter how many times I had prepared his lunch, no matter how carefully I had chosen his ties and adjusted them for him each morning, I was nothing more than an unplanned detour in his life. That mansion was never meant for me. And neither was Albert. I took a deep breath and met his gaze. You promised not to remarry within 5 years, and I believe you still have feelings for me. But at the same time, you've allowed rumors about you and Ms. Paisley to spread. You've tied the Austin Group's future to her family. You're asking me to go back to sanatorium with you, wanting to start over. But we both know you would never give up your empire for me. Albert's throat bobbed as he swallowed. Irene, his voice was raw, hoarse. The usually composed, untouchable CEO looked almost fragile. I know I failed you before. I know I made you suffer. But I can fix this. His grip on my hand tightened. I'll talk to my mother. She'll change her attitude. The entire Austin family will respect you. We can be happy again. This has nothing to do with the Austin Group, so why? I exhaled softly. It seems you still can't make a choice. Albert faltered, his grip loosening. Albert, I said gently, you have your brilliant career. And I have my own path. Maybe it's small, maybe it's ordinary, but it's mine. Some flowers bloom wild in untamed fields. But your world isn't the wilderness. It never was. I stepped back, my voice steady, final. You and I were never meant to walk the same path. For the remainder of the walk, I used my phone's flashlight, and Albert did the same. We moved in silence, the soft glow of our lights illuminating the narrow path ahead. As we neared the community gate, I suddenly felt a tug on my sleeve. Albert's fingers trembled slightly. In a low voice, he murmured, I've always loved you. I just couldn't express it in time. I gently pulled my sleeve free and replied calmly, it's not about timing, Albert. It's about the choices you made. Without the accident on Christmas Day, our lives would have continued as planned, separate and untouched by each other. Leo and the twins had stopped fighting, but the way the twins looked at him now was filled with deep resentment. Before getting into the car, Albert cast me a long, unreadable look. I'll come to see you again. No, I shook my head. It's best if we don't meet again. And the children shouldn't either. The twins' glares darkened with hostility, mirroring the way they looked at Leo. Albert remained silent for a moment, before finally turning away and leading them into the car. As the Land Rover pulled away, Leo reached for my hand and whispered, Mom, I was wrong. I glanced down at him. What happened? Leo pressed his lips together, hesitating. After a moment, he admitted they kept saying awful things. I couldn't stand it anymore, so I added some bitter gourd juice to their fish soup. The extreme bitterness must have left them speechless. Leo sighed, looking guilty. They're still your children. I shouldn't have done that. I smiled and squeezed his hand. Aren't you my only child? Then, unable to help myself, I let out a soft sigh. But now, I'm afraid your dream of getting into a top college won't come true. I don't care. Leo looked up at me, his eyes steady and full of conviction. I've decided to go to Southern Medical College. The principal personally recommended me, and someone will be coming to interview me soon. I hesitated. No matter how good Southern Medical College was, it couldn't compare to the prestigious universities and sanatorium, where Leo had originally been destined to go. But Leo simply smiled, his expression warm and unwavering. Between chasing success and staying with you, I will always choose you, Mom. Not long after, Leo left for Southern Medical College. A year later, when he came home for a visit, he brought me a lotus flower from the entrance of the community. Maybe someone picked it up by the artificial lake and tossed it aside, he said, carefully placing the delicate bloom in my hands. The end.